It is just after 2 p.m. on Saturday the 11th of May, 1996. A McDonnell Douglas DC9 lines up on runway 9 left at Miami International Airport. The DC9 is being operated by Valujet, a low-cost carrier in operation since only 1992. Valujet Flight 592's destination is Atlanta, Georgia. The DC9 carries 105 passengers and 5 crew members. In command is Captain Candalyn Kubeck, aged 35, and First Officer Richard Hazen, aged 52. Their departure from Miami has been delayed by just over an hour due to mechanical problems. The aircraft's autopilot is not functioning, and the cabin-to-cockpit intercom is also not operational. Nevertheless, these faults are not severe enough to ground the aircraft, and the flight can continue. First Officer Hazen smoothly applies takeoff power while Kubeck controls the aircraft during the takeoff roll. Hazen calls out the aircraft's progress as it gathers speed down the runway. V1, the speed at which Captain Kubeck must decide whether to continue or abort the takeoff. VR, the speed at which Kubeck begins to climb the aircraft. V2, the speed at which the aircraft can still take off should an engine fail. The aircraft's takeoff is entirely uneventful, and the DC-9 begins climbing into a blue Florida sky. Nobody on board is aware that a chain reaction has already begun which will leave the passengers and crew dead within 10 minutes. This is Inside the Black Box.
Pull up! Pull up!
As the aircraft continues to climb, the two pilots complete takeoff checks, while the cabin crew describe the in-flight service options. Cocktails are available for $3, beers are available for $2, correct change is greatly appreciated. Captain Kubeck activates the aircraft's weather radar. Kubeck and First Officer Hazen discuss a thunderstorm about 8 miles from their position. Judging the weather to be calm in their area, they turn off the fasten seatbelt sign. 6 minutes after takeoff, the problems begin. As the aircraft is continuing to climb past 9,000 feet, a loud pop is heard by the pilots in their headsets. After questioning what they heard, both pilots conclude that they are suffering from an electrical problem. Even as they draw this conclusion, electrical systems begin to fail in the cockpit, and the aircraft's battery charger starts to operate, indicating a problem with the plane's power. Kubeck states that they are losing everything. Within 15 seconds of the first indication of an issue, Kubeck makes the decision to return to Miami International Airport. In the cockpit, muffled shouts can be heard from the cabin area of the aircraft, becoming clearer and louder. Multiple people are shouting that the aircraft is on fire. 30 seconds after the first sign of a problem, First Officer Hazen contacts Miami International, requesting an immediate return to the airport. Hazen informs Miami they have smoke in the cockpit and in the cabin of the aircraft. Meanwhile, Kubeck levels off the aircraft from its climb and begins to descend. But Kubeck is finding the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. A few seconds later, a member of Valujet's cabin crew comes into the cockpit, coughing and requesting that the passengers' oxygen masks be deployed. The pilots both refuse. Both know that in the event of a fire, the oxygen masks will do nothing to help the passengers. The masks are designed to enable passengers to maintain consciousness should the aircraft lose pressurization at altitude. They work by supplementing the thin air at high altitudes with additional oxygen. But because they do not seal over the face, the passengers would continue to breathe the smoke in the cabin and still lose consciousness. The deployment of the masks might actually make the fire worse by adding additional oxygen into the environment. The cabin crew member informs the pilots that they are completely on fire. First Officer Hazen amends his request to Miami, informing them that they need to land at the closest available airport. Shortly after this final message, the cockpit voice recorder stops operating, A few seconds later, the flight data recorder also stops functioning. Miami Air Traffic Control continues to try and contact the aircraft. What happens next is pieced together from eyewitnesses and the DC-9's transponder, which continued to function. An aircraft's transponder provides more information to air traffic control than just the aircraft's position. It provides data such as the aircraft's altitude and its identity. The DC-9 begins to turn back towards Miami International Airport before entering a very steep descent. Valujet Flight 592 plummets 6,400 feet in just 30 seconds, about the same speed as a free-falling skydiver. After this rapid dive, the descent slows at only 1,000 feet above the ground, with a course that will bring it back to Miami International Airport. Suddenly, the aircraft rolls sharply to the right and dives again. The 48-ton aircraft smashes into the Florida Everglades, traveling at approximately 400 knots. There is no explosion or fire. Immediately after the impact, the scene is eerily quiet, almost as if the aircraft has been swallowed up by the marshy ground below. One of the eyewitnesses to the accident, a private pilot, radios Miami Air Traffic Control to inform them. Rescuers are dispatched immediately in order to search for survivors, but the crash site is almost inaccessible. The Florida Everglades is a huge area of tropical wetlands, characterized by marshes and sawgrass prairies. The impact crater is 8.5 miles from the nearest main road, so the only means of accessing the crash site are by airboat or helicopter. When rescuers do finally arrive, they are not confronted by the usual chaotic scenes of an aircraft accident, but instead by a large crater in the marsh with hundreds of tiny pieces of wreckage barely visible from above. The rescuers cannot even find any bodies, let alone survivors. Their search efforts are hampered by the approaching darkness, the thick vegetation, and the presence of threats including alligators and poisonous snakes. As night falls, they have found no survivors. The National Transportation Safety Board, responsible for investigating civil transportation accidents in America, dispatches a GO team to the crash site. Their first priority is to recover the wreckage of the aircraft. While initially expecting to see fairly intact wreckage due to the soft area of impact, the use of ground-penetrating radar reveals that below the marsh is solid limestone. The aircraft has impacted this at hundreds of miles per hour and effectively shattered. The small pieces of wreckage are for the most part collected by hand and loaded into airboats. The work is exhausting because almost all of it must be done manually. The weather is more than 30 degrees Celsius and the searchers must constantly wade through thick mud and vegetation, not to mention water that is contaminated with aviation fuel. In order to manage the threat of alligators, marksmen are brought in. Recovered wreckage is transported to the nearest levee, where it is cleaned before being transported to a local airport for identification. The searchers find that the right side of the aircraft is more heavily fragmented than the left, suggesting that the aircraft struck the ground while banking to the right. They also note that the engines have ingested large amounts of sawgrass, mud, and aircraft debris, indicating that they were functioning when the DC-9 impacted the swamp. The DC-9's flight data recorder was recovered on May 13th, 2 days after the accident. Preliminary findings are released the following day. The investigators indicated that there may have been an explosion on board based on a rise in pressure recorded approximately 6 minutes into the flight. Confirming what the investigators had been told by air traffic control, that Valujet 592 had reported a fire, the NTSB investigators note significant fire damage from the wreckage recovered, which made up the front of the aircraft. In particular, the investigators study the wreckage which belonged to the forward cargo compartment. They note that while there are soot marks on the inside walls of the cargo compartment, there is no significant sooting on the outside of the walls. This suggests to the investigators that the fire originated in this area rather than spreading to it. This is backed up by analysing other areas of the aircraft and finding no significant indication of fire. The fire in this area of the aircraft was so hot that it was able to melt the aluminium floor beams in the passenger cabin above. However, based on the design of this cargo compartment, this should be impossible. In the United States in 1996, cargo areas within passenger aircraft were divided into several classes. Class A is an area of the aircraft where a fire can be easily detected and the crew has access to extinguish it, such as the cabin area. Class B is an area of the aircraft where a crew member can access to extinguish a fire, and which is fitted with a smoke detector since the crew would not normally be in this area of the aircraft. Class C is an area of the aircraft which is not accessible by the crew, but which contains a smoke detector and remote fire suppression system. Class D, the area where the fire appears to have started, is an area of the aircraft which is not accessible by the crew and does not contain a fire detection or suppression system. This area should have no airflow, and any fire which occurred here would be completely localized and extinguished through oxygen starvation. The investigators' attentions turned to what was inside the forward cargo hold, which could have caused a fire. After looking at the manifest, they determined that the forward cargo hold was loaded with about 30 kilos of mail, several aircraft tires, and some cardboard boxes labelled COMAT, a designation for Valujet Company material. These boxes were labelled oxy canisters, empty. It soon becomes clear that the contents of the boxes labelled COMAT were not oxygen canisters, but oxygen generators. Should an aircraft lose pressurization and the masks drop from the ceiling of the cabin compartment, passengers are required to pull firmly down on the masks to start the flow of oxygen. What is actually happening is the passenger is releasing a spring which strikes a percussion cap that in turn activates an oxygen generator. The generator is a metal tube filled with chemicals which when activated produce oxygen. They function for approximately 12 minutes, which is enough time for an aircraft to descend to a point where the air is dense enough for passengers to maintain consciousness. However, a significant byproduct of that chemical reaction is heat. The oxygen generators are immediately considered a prime suspect in what started the fire, and the NTSB releases a statement to this effect 3 days after the accident. Backing up this theory, the searchers find some of the generators at the crash site. Several of them show signs of activation. In order to test the theory that the oxygen generators could be responsible for a fire in the cargo hold, in November of 1996, the NTSB created a mock-up of the Class D cargo compartment in which they believed the fire began. They loaded it with oxygen generators, tires, and other items to simulate the mail. Through a series of tests, they demonstrated that given the right conditions, the generators could initiate a fire which could reach over 1,700 degrees Celsius, more than twice what is required to melt the aluminium floor beams. The test also confirmed the source of the pop which the pilots heard as their problems began, which was linked with a spike in the aircraft's pressure readings. This was in fact one of the pressurized tires in the cargo hold rupturing due to heat. The sudden release of gas caused a pressure spike which was detected by the aircraft's static ports. The function of static ports will be described in another episode, but suffice to say they are part of the aircraft's systems to measure altitude, airspeed, and the rate of climb or descent, and on the DC9 they are located close to the forward cargo compartment. The full picture of Valujet 592's downfall now becomes clear. At some point, after the generators were loaded into the cargo bay, one or more of them was activated. This produced oxygen, defeating the airtight seal in the Class D cargo compartment, and generated heat, which led to a fire. The NTSB believed that the oxygen generator was likely activated when it was knocked during taxi or takeoff. Undetected by the passengers because of the cargo hold's airtight nature, and undetected by the pilots because of the lack of any fire detection system, the fire built up insidiously, feeding off the other oxygen generators and the flammable cargo around it. By the time the tire ruptured and the passengers finally became aware of the fire, it was most likely too late for Valujet 592. Burning at over 1,000 degrees Celsius, the fire tore through the fireproof liner of the cargo compartment. Above the cargo compartment ran the DC-9's control cables and electrical wiring. The wiring quickly melted, which accounts for the pilots losing electrical systems in the cockpit and dropouts on the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. Also running above the cargo compartment were the aircraft's control cables for the DC-9's rear-mounted engines. Damage to these caused the right engine to slow down, while the left engine continued to produce full power, causing the aircraft to yaw to the side. The pilots were able to stay in at least partial control of the aircraft because they applied opposite control inputs to counter the asymmetry in engine power. As the fire continued to develop, causing the floor beams of the aircraft to melt and further distort the control cables, the aircraft finally became uncontrollable, rolled to the right, and completed its plunge into the Florida Everglades. The NTSB also stated that the pilots may have finally been rendered unconscious by smoke or heat in the cockpit. Those who had not been killed by the fire in the aircraft were killed instantly on impact. While the source of the fire was established fairly quickly, the loose generators were never supposed to be transported aboard a passenger aircraft. So how did they end up in the hold of Valujet Flight 592? In early 1996, Valujet agreed to purchase 3 McDonnell Douglas MD-80s from the manufacturer. The 3 aircraft were flown from the last locations they operated to Miami. There, they were to be modified by Valujet's maintenance contractor, SaberTech. Part of the aircraft overhaul was to inspect the oxygen generators to determine whether they had passed their service life. SaberTech inspected the aircraft and found that 2 of the 3 MD-80s had oxygen generators which had expired and required replacement. Valujet requested that all oxygen generators in the 2 aircraft were replaced. SaberTech employees began the task of removing the expired oxygen generators in mid-March of 1996 and replacing them with new models. The correct procedure was to remove the generators and either activate them to make them safe or fit the canister with a safety cap. Because of time pressures and the lack of safety caps due to them being unusual spares, the old generators were removed and the lanyards used to activate them were secured by the side of the canister with adhesive tape. The generators were then fitted with a green tag indicating that they were repairable and placed in cardboard boxes. No safety caps were applied. At the beginning of May, these cardboard boxes were taken to SaberTech's storage facility for other Valujet company parts. On the 7th of May, a SaberTech director visited the storage facility and ordered that the area be cleaned up as a potential client would be visiting. The director instructed that all items should be removed from the floor. It was understood that the parts in Valujet's storage area would be removed shortly and transported to their headquarters in Georgia. A member of SaberTech's stores team loosely packed the boxes containing the oxygen generators with bubble wrap and taped them shut. He then attached a shipping label titled COMAT for company material and listed the contents as oxy canisters, empty. The generators were marked as empty because the employee saw green tags and had not been told that the contents were hazardous. On May 11th, the generators to be transported to Atlanta were driven from SaberTech's facility to the Valujet loading ramp at Miami International Airport. Valujet personnel saw the boxes contained COMAT with no hazardous material and loaded these onto Valujet 592 to be transported back to Georgia in the hold. The disaster of Valujet 592 might be seen as a series of unpredictable events which led to the fire, but this is not the case. A very similar accident occurred 8 years earlier. American Airlines Flight 132 was a DC-9, the same aircraft that flew for Valujet 592. As the DC-9 was en route from Dallas-Fort Worth to Nashville, Tennessee, passengers in the cabin notified the crew of smoke. Later, the floor of the passenger cabin began to melt. The aircraft safely landed and all aboard were evacuated. The NTSB determined that an oxidizer had been loaded into the Class D cargo compartment and a chemical fire had occurred due to other chemicals present. At that time, the NTSB recommended the Federal Aviation Administration, who has overall authority for regulating aviation in the United States, mandate that fire detection and suppression systems should be installed in all Class D cargo compartments. They also recommended more stringent regulation on the transportation of oxidizers. 4 years later, the FAA concluded that the cost to have all Class D cargo compartments converted did not meet the cost-benefit criteria required. The NTSB cannot regulate itself. It can only make recommendations. The NTSB therefore held the following responsible for the accident: Sabertech, Valujet's maintenance contractor, who did not properly prepare, package, and identify the unexpended oxygen generators; Valujet, for not providing suitable oversight of its contractors for failing to adhere to maintenance, training, and hazardous material requirements; the FAA, for failing to require smoke detection and fire suppression systems to be installed in Class D cargo compartments. Even before the publication of the NTSB's report into Valujet 592, the FAA released an NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, in June 1997. This required that all Class D cargo compartments be converted to Class C, that is, having fire detection and suppression systems. Airlines had 3 years to comply. For its role in the crash, a federal grand jury found Sabertech guilty of mishandling hazardous materials and improper training. The individual employees responsible were not prosecuted, though one, Mauro Valenzuela Reyes, who failed to appear at court, is still wanted by the FBI in connection to the incident. In an attempt to shake its reputation, Valujet rebranded itself as Airtran, the name of an airline it had purchased. Airtran was subsequently purchased by Southwest Airlines in 2011. As of 2014, Airtran ceased to exist as an operating airline. The disaster has led to safer skies through the changes made to Class D cargo compartments and rules relating to transporting hazardous materials. It is unfortunate that these lessons had to be learned in blood before the FAA took action. This has been Inside the Black Box. Thank you for listening. Please remember to subscribe so you are made aware of future episodes.